Picture this. A commercial diver is working the bottom of a bay off the coast of Nova Scotia. Routine job, nothing unusual. Visibility is poor, the way it always is down there. Just murky green water and sediment, and the kind of silence that makes you aware of how far you are from everything. And then his light catches something in the silt. He reaches down. He pulls it free. It's a sword. Straight blade, distinct crossguard. The kind of proportions that any historian would recognize in an instant. Not because it looks old, but because it looks specifically, unmistakably Roman. Now, here's the problem. According to every textbook ever written, Rome never crossed the Atlantic. The first Europeans to set foot on this continent were the Vikings, around 1000 AD. Columbus arrived in 1492. That's the timeline. That's what we were all taught. That's what the maps say. Nobody told the sword. To understand why this find is so combustible, you have to go back to Rome in the 1st and 2nd century AD, to the era historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. By this point, Rome isn't just a city or even just an empire. It's the most sophisticated logistics operation the ancient world had ever produced. The Roman navy controlled the Mediterranean so completely that they simply called it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Their trade routes stretched to India, to China, to corners of Africa that most Europeans of the time couldn't have found on a map, even if they'd had one. And Roman merchants, Roman sailors, Roman explorers were consumed by a single obsession that turns up again and again in the literature of the period. What is out there? What lies beyond the edge of the known world? The Greek geographer Strabo wrote about Atlantic islands far to the west of Africa. Pliny, the Elder, described what he called the Fortunate Islands, somewhere out in the open ocean. And then there's Seneca, the philosopher, the playwright, the man who tutored the Emperor Nero, who in the year 60 AD wrote a line so extraordinary that Christopher Columbus actually copied it into his own journal 15 centuries later. Seneca wrote, "A time will come when the ocean will loosen its chains and a vast land will be revealed." He wrote that in 60 AD. Where did that idea come from? Now, back to the sword. In 1991, the artifact made its way to J. Houston McCulloch, an economist at Ohio State University, with a serious sideline in amateur archaeology. McCulloch ran a metallurgical analysis, and this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable for the conventional timeline. The alloy composition, the specific ratio of lead, tin, and iron in the blade, was consistent with Roman smelting techniques from the 1st and 2nd century AD, not medieval European metallurgy, not 16th century Spanish or Portuguese smithing. McCulloch made a point that's hard to argue with. To fake this artifact convincingly, a forger would have needed to know the lead isotope ratios specific to Roman-era smelting, data that science didn't even identify until the 1970s. You can't fake backwards what no one knew to look for. The sword was real. Here's what really keeps you up at night, though. The sword wasn't alone. In the same general area off the coast of Nova Scotia, near Oak Island, the same stretch of coastline that has been driving treasure hunters to the edge of obsession for 200 years. Divers and researchers have recovered other objects that don't belong there. A Roman-style shield boss, coins that don't match any European mintage from the colonial period, and most strangely, an anchor whose design is essentially identical to anchors used on Roman merchant galleys. One anomalous find is a curiosity. A cluster of them in the same location is something else entirely. But even that pales next to what turned up on the other side of the continent. In 1933, during excavations at the pre-Columbian site of Tecaxic, Calixtlahuaca, in Mexico, an archaeologist named Jose Garcia Payon found a small terracotta head in a layer of soil that was unambiguously pre-contact. The face had features that didn't belong to any indigenous Mesoamerican population. In 1995, researchers at New York University dated it to the 2nd century AD, over 1,300 years before Columbus. The Mexican National Institute of Anthropology reviewed the find and issued their official conclusion: accidental inclusion, a contaminant. Something that got into the layer by mistake. Accidental inclusion. That phrase does a lot of heavy lifting in academic archaeology. It doesn't mean we don't know how to explain this. It means this can't be right, so it isn't. Because the alternative is a conversation nobody in the institution wants to have. Now, the skeptics have a fair question here, and it deserves a real answer. How would a Roman vessel even end up off the coast of Canada? The answer is the North Atlantic Gyre, a system of permanent ocean currents that circulates in a great loop across the entire North Atlantic. Oceanographers have confirmed that a ship losing steerage off the coast of Portugal could be carried to the Caribbean in 3 to 4 weeks without a single oar stroke. The Romans knew these currents existed. Pliny himself described ships that vanished into the Atlantic and returned months later carrying unfamiliar fruit, and stories of lands no one could locate on any chart. This doesn't mean Rome was sending expeditions to the New World, but it does mean that an accidental crossing was physically possible, and that the wreckage of such a crossing could, very plausibly, be sitting on the seafloor off Nova Scotia right now. And here's where we have to be honest, with you and with ourselves. Nothing presented here proves that Romans made regular contact with North America. The sword could have arrived as part of a later European collector's belongings. The Mexican figurine could have traveled through trade networks we haven't mapped yet. Academic caution isn't cowardice, and it isn't conspiracy. It's the mechanism that keeps history from becoming whatever story happens to be most exciting at the time. That matters. But here's what that caution doesn't answer. Why has this sword never been subjected to a full analysis by a major university laboratory? Why does it sit in a private collection, inaccessible to researchers? When journalists and independent investigators contacted archaeology departments at North American universities asking for comment on the find, most of them simply didn't respond. The ones who did said more or less the same thing. This falls outside our current research priorities. Think about that for a moment. A potentially civilization rewriting artifact pulled from the ocean floor off the coast of Canada, and it falls outside their priorities. Remember how the story of Lonso Meadows unfolded when Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad stood up in 1960 and said he'd found evidence of a Norse settlement in Newfoundland, centuries before Columbus. The academic establishment laughed him out of the room. It took nearly a decade before the field accepted that he was right. History isn't a finished document. It's a living argument, and it changes every time someone pulls something out of the water that wasn't supposed to be there. The Roman sword off Nova Scotia is either an extraordinary accident or evidence that the ancient Atlantic world was far more connected than our textbooks have ever been willing to admit. Or it's a hoax that for some reason, no one in 30+ years has ever bothered to definitively debunk. Every one of those possibilities leads to the same question. Why don't we know the answer yet? If that sword is real, what else is down there, waiting for someone to finally decide it's worth their time?